All right. I think we will get started for this afternoon. Again, good afternoon, everyone, or actually good morning for one of our speakers, and welcome. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you to our webinar on aligning AU-EU interests to reshape global governance on peace and security, and open this discussion in partnership between ECDPM and SAIIA with the support of the Global Challenges Foundation. The briefing note that we are launching today starts from a rather stark premise. The multilateral system is not simply under strain, it's actually in a moment of rupture. The UN Security Council in particular faces a deep legitimacy and functionality crisis, which has been exposed over the paralysis over Ukraine, Gaza, and also other conflicts. And by a growing disconnection between global power realities and the institutional design of the UN structures. For both Europe and Africa, this matters profoundly, but obviously not in identical ways. So the core question that this briefing note, and in fact the joint project by ECDPM and SAIIA overall try to ask, is a pragmatic one. How can Europe and Africa move beyond the rhetorical alignment that exists and translate those shared commitments to multilateralism into tangible operational collaboration on UN reform? And our research showed that while there is real divergence, particularly on speed, sequencing, and also the scope of Security Council reform, there are also meaningful areas of convergence. And so this shows that the credibility of these reforms will need to move from declarations and stated commitments to delivery. And this moment really matters. We are in a reform window taking place in a moment of rupture. The Pact for the Future and the UN80 reform process are creating political momentum, but reform is unlikely to happen only with grand bargains alone. So it will depend on sequencing, combining near-term operational wins, but also longer-term structural ambitions shared between Europe and Africa. With these opening remarks, I'd like to hand over to Stephen Gruzd, and after that to Gustavo de Carvalho, who will walk us through the key findings and recommendations. After Stephen's remarks and Gustavo's presentation, we will then come back to a facilitated moderation with Gustavo and also with Richard Gowan from the Crisis Group. Welcome, everyone, and handing over to Stephen.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and greetings, everybody, from a cloudy summer's day in Johannesburg. It's fantastic to see so many people from around the world joining for this webinar. It's been a pleasure working with the ECDPM over the last probably bulk of a year. We had an event in Addis in November, and this policy briefing that's being launched today built upon that encounter. And we also would like to thank the Global Challenges Foundation for their support of this project and for supporting the two institutions. So as Sophie said, the multilateral peace and security system is no longer fit for purpose, and will tinkering at the margins save it? We have conflicts around the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, in places like the DRC, in Sudan. Of course, today marks the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia 4 years ago, and all the destruction and chaos that has caused in the multilateral system. And I think it's something that we should bear in mind. But we have a system that is really creaking, that is failing to deliver peace, justice, or accountability. Alternatives are being established, whether it's the BRICS, which is growing in its numbers. It's doubled its size in the last couple of years. Whether it's Donald Trump's Board for Peace. And interestingly, Africa doesn't seem to matter very much. There are 2 North African countries, Egypt and Morocco, that are part of the Board of Peace, but the rest of the continent has been seen as totally irrelevant by the Trump administration. Are Europe and Africa going to be mere passive objects, or are we going to be shaping the global order that is to come? Are agreements like the Esselwini consensus, which was decided by Africa 20 years ago that Africa wants two permanent seats with a veto in a reformed UN Security Council, but has not said who those two seats would be occupied by. And there are at least three or four contenders for those two seats in a game of diplomatic musical chairs. Africa is demanding voice, is demanding agency, is demanding structural change. We saw a successful G20 hosted by South Africa, but then South Africa frozen out of the G20 process by the USA this year and not being invited to any of the meetings. As Sophie said, how do we move from rhetoric to coalition politics? How do we assert Europe-Africa leadership in this international system? I mean, we just had the 7th AU-EU summit in Luanda in Angola last year, and it reaffirmed a shared commitment to a more representative and accountable Security Council, but statements are not reforms. How is the momentum going to be built amongst other developing countries, amongst European countries, to shape the world that we really want? Today, we are launching our policy brief, which is grounded as I said, in a high-level Addis Ababa roundtable with senior policymakers and experts. The brief moves beyond generic calls for reform and identifies where Africa and Europe converge, where they diverge, and where pragmatic collaboration is possible. Our ambition is not to just produce another document for the shelf, but to shape policy debates, inform diplomacy, and influence reform pathways at a moment when the global system is unusually fluid. We are living through a historic transition. The post-Cold War order is ending, but the next order is not yet formed. Moments like this are dangerous, but they are also opportunities for institutional innovation and political leadership. Africa and Europe can help write the next chapter of multilateral peace and security governance. The question is whether they will. So we are setting ambitious targets for our two continents. And with that, I'll hand back to Sophie, or is it going to go straight through to Gustavo?
Thank you very much, Stephen. We can immediately go to Gustavo indeed. Gustavo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Stephen, for those brilliant remarks.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And I wanted to jump in from what Sophie and Steve have mentioned in their opening remarks on what is the context in which we designed this briefing notes on how Africa and Europe see not only multilateralism, but what are some of the pathways, avenues, ideas, convergence, divergence that we see these two continents are playing when it comes to multilateral institutions that are not just rhetorical exercise for either of the continents. For both African and European countries, multilateralism matters because there is a strong significance of understanding that we understand that individually we are quite weak. And collectively, this is what provides us much stronger avenues for rules that better benefits us, to stabilities that leads us to a more stable and sustainable development pathway for both continents. So in that sense, the crisis of multilateralism at the moment, whether it's the limited credibility and effectiveness of the UN Security Council, including through the creation of competing bodies like the Board for Peace. We just had recently the inaugural meeting that was held in Washington and was mentioned by both Sophie and Steve. We had 2 weeks ago the intergovernmental negotiating, intergovernmental IGN on Security Council reform that met in New York and reaffirmed many of those commitments on Security Council reform. But also we understand that the United Nations faces a dire financial liquidity crisis, where there's been warnings that the UN could run out of cash by July, and what will be the implications not only for this collective security arrangements that we have created since 1945, but particularly how do we strengthen those tools that are intrinsically seen as beneficial for the two continents. How we developed this brief, and that was important to us to not see that as a theoretical exercise. We needed to see how different policymakers, diplomats, analysts from both regions, but also those based in New York, see and think about those questions. So for over a period of 3 months between July and September last year, we've engaged on dozens of interviews with experts and practitioners from these two regions, and also those based in New York and in Addis Ababa, to fundamentally ask them the questions: how our two continents see those issues, and what are some of the mechanisms that we need to identify and develop, actively developed, to ensure there is a stronger multilateral presence within a space of a retraction, not only of the United States, but a much more transactional way in which many countries' foreign policies are geared towards. As Steve mentioned, we tested many of these ideas and gathered orders in November within a workshop, which led to a number of findings for us in terms of where are those convergences, where are those divergences, and perhaps what are some further areas that both continents need to explore within a new moment, perhaps of rupture, but we could also see that as a moment of rebuilding credibility and institutional capability to respond to global challenges. So when it comes to convergence points, and there was quite a few that we have identified, and that our interviewees and participants in our closed-door roundtable in November identified. I think one of them that is quite important, and it was quite clear in our interactions, is that despite the fact that both continents remain committed, at least in rhetoric and in principle, to a Security Council reform, it was quite clear that for many of them there are other pathways in terms of reforming multilateral institutions beyond the scope of amending the UN Charter. So in that sense, pursuing better mechanisms and approaches that makes the working methods of the UN Security Council was very present in many of our conversations, in ways that was recognized that the need for more transparency, better engagement of regional organizations, stronger briefing practices, accountability around vetoes, were all seen as part of a potential Security Council reform, but very much as part of more technical and political discussions around how to better arrange the division of labor, scopes and approaches of different members. And the one thing within these aspects that was particularly present in our discussion was the role of the ETAN, the non-permanent members, that there is a potential for them not only to continue to show increasing collective agency. Of course, the capability of the ETAN is very dependent on who those members are, but to other extents, to recognize that both Europe and Africa tend to have, and have over the years, created increasingly sophisticated moments of regional coordination, whether through European, particularly through the European Union presence within New York, but increasingly so through the role of the A3 within the UN Security Council, and these evolving mechanisms that have been developed both in terms of institutional capabilities of our regional organizations, being that the European Union or being the African Union, and in certain degrees there are further spaces for these two regions to not only collectively and internally within the regions to create coordination mechanisms that enhances their visibility and enhances potentially the effectiveness, but also across regions. And that was something that was one of the more obvious findings or points of convergence. The second point of convergence was certainly the issue around predictable financing for African responses to peace and security challenges in the continent. And in that regard, we can acknowledge that the fact that perhaps African countries are seen as hierarchically lower in terms of levels of importance of how those issues are seen as critical geopolitical aspects, but it still remains majority of the discussions within the Security Council being on African issues. We still have majority of the UN Security Council resolutions reflecting on African issues, and particularly when it comes to the implementation of Resolution 2719, now almost 3 years old, that was an important milestone in terms of attempting to break many of those ad hoc funding practices that we've seen within this space in Africa, but also showcases a very important degree of convergence of views that generating more sustainable and predictable financing processes is important not only for Africa, but also for Europe, where the European Union effectively was instrumental in supporting the eventual passing of the resolution 2719. Of course, the big question there is, how do we really implement that? Almost 3 years later, we still have a resolution that is unimplemented, and it is to a certain degree hostage to this liquidity crisis that the UN currently has. Third point of convergence here relates to the fact that we have an increasingly institutionalized relationship between the African Union and the United Nations, but also an increasingly institutionalized relationship between the European Union and the United Nations. Perhaps something that was quite present in many of the conversations and discussions that we've had is that we need to look into mechanisms to create a more triangular relationship between the European Union, the African Union, and the United Nations in that point. It is important to mention that those points of convergence, they didn't feel and were not presented purely from a principle point of view, but really from a pragmatic sense, that it is driven by this need, not only by a desire to restore our international capabilities to deal with international crises. Of course, there were a number of points of divergence that were identified within those discussions, and certainly one of those is speed and sequencing of those. For African countries, the narrative and the approach and the expectation, it is to have an immediate structural change within the United Nations and within those mechanisms that we have developed, and particularly following, as Steve mentioned, the common position that Africa has on UN Security Council reform. There's a winning consensus. For European colleagues, the belief on speed and sequencing felt much more gradual, ideas of procedural fixes, and the need to treat a lot of those underrepresented regions more equally. That, I think, it shows that for African countries, it was perceived that we need to get a seat first, then figure out how we're going to share it. While for European colleagues, we need to show how we're going to share it, and then we're going to be able to persuade others. The second aspect that has a lot to do with language and how do we present those. For many African players, there was a lot of skepticism of ideas like the rules-based order framing, because they often were felt to be very specific to a certain view of the world that brought up a lot of ideas of double standards. And for many African players, these ideas was much more based on how do we anchor that within international law rather than a rules-based order. What does it mean in reality? And I will conclude here so that we can deal with our discussions. One of them is that this big question about who drives that change. And it was clear to many that the reform won't come inside the UN alone. So therefore, the role of our regional institutions, whether it's the African Union, whether it's the United Nations, will play an important role, and strengthening a lot of these mechanisms was fundamentally seen as a space for that to be done. Of course, that will lead to us to a number of issues that we need to look forward, whether it's the UN80 process that has been occurring for the past 2 years, but particularly now with the Secretary General succession debates and discussions that will lead into an important space for Africa and Europe to bring back those discussions, both in terms of the discussions within the Security Council, within the General Assembly, within the IGN on Security Council reform, but I think particularly for Africa within the C10 or the group of African countries dealing with or discussing some options around that. Second issue that I think is important to watch, and was very clear within the discussions and within the workshop, is that even though the Board of Peace is still somehow uncertain to what it will effectively be doing, but it certainly will create a stress test of the capability of the multilateral institutions to do that. And the final point in that we need to look, that was quite important for many of our interviewees, that many of those felt that while looking into Security Council reform is important, we cannot fully disassociate that to reform of international financial institutions, whether it's the IMF, whether it's the World Bank, that are particularly interlinked in that regard. Let me close here, Sophie, so that we can go into the discussions, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you very, very much, Gustavo, for the presentation of our policy brief, and for also for Stephen and you also to taking us back to sort of the whole process that went before this, and also thanking everyone for their time and contributions in speaking with us throughout this project. And also wanted to mention, of course, one of our other co-authors, Sara Gianicello, who's here with us today here in the webinar. We will now move to our panel discussion for about, I would say, 40 minutes or so, a little bit less, so that we can also have a discussion with participants. We have quite a large number here, so what I would propose is that you put your questions in the chat, and then I will read them out to the two speakers that we'll have for the panel discussion, which will be Gustavo, but also Richard Gowan from the crisis group. I think that's it in terms of logistics. So my first question would actually be to Richard. It's rather a broad one to start with. As Gustavo noted, the paper suggests that, I mean, multilateral reform is not only or no longer only about defending multilateralism in principle, but really about recalibrating the different reform strategies of different partners in a world order that is increasingly fragmented. So are we still trying to save the same system that is in place, or are we already in practice redesigning a new one? And where do you see this headed in the medium to long term? Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you, Sophie. And before I answer that very easy question, congratulations on what is, I think, a very good paper that really does capture the state of discussions in Europe, in Africa, but also between Europe and Africa about Security Council reform. I mean, I think my first response to you, Sophie, would be we are clearly in a moment where there is enormous desire to see fundamental reforms to the UN system. And one indicator of that is that last September, in the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, 190 countries gave their speeches. I think 130 or 140 emphasized the need for UN reform, but more specifically, 100 leaders said that we need Security Council reform. And so I think it is clear that there is something approaching a global consensus that the Security Council is not working. And even if you talk to diplomats from the existing 5 veto powers, none of them would pretend that the Security Council is functioning properly. That's actually quite different to the same conversation 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when a lot of people would say, okay, the Council is not doing very well over Syria, or the Council isn't doing very well over Mali, but overall it's holding up. Now there is a real sense that it's broken down. I think that the challenge remains that actually achieving reform, however good the strategies we have are, will be very, very hard. And that is built in to the UN Charter, because the UN Charter, as I think probably everyone on the call knows, says that you can't reform the Charter without having ratifications from 2/3 of the UN membership, including all of the current 5 veto powers. And we're at a moment where one of those veto powers, the US under President Trump, is making it pretty clear behind the scenes that it is not interested in reform at all. The Biden administration did actually talk about reform, and the Biden administration did offer permanent seats for African members. The Trump team is saying in private, yeah, we're just not interested in that. And Trump himself is going off down the road of the Board of Peace, which, as I think Stephen said, is a body that largely excludes sub-Saharan Africa. Whether by design or just by mistake is not super clear. And I think there are other powers, I think Russia and China fall into this camp too, that are really quite happy with the status quo. And I think really will oppose most potential reform packages. And so, I feel that we're in a situation where there is a huge head of steam for reform. And it's certainly true that I think the African group is voicing this desire for reform, most strongly. But there may just be fundamental obstacles. And this can lead to a couple of different outcomes. But it seems to me that it may force us down a pathway where actually we do start thinking beyond how do we reform this very, very hard to change Security Council, and how do we start creating alternatives. Now, there are lots of disadvantages to that, but if President Trump is allowed to dream up the Board of Peace essentially overnight, then what is to stop Europe and Africa dreaming up their own Board of even more peace, or whatever you would like to call it? I think that we will see a continuing diffusion of peace and security discussions if we don't find a way to reform the institutions that we have.
Thanks, Richard. So my next question was actually to build on that a little bit, and kind of, as Gustavo mentioned, there was kind of an inherent tension on Africa on the one side, or African member states prioritizing structural reform, while Europe emphasizing more procedural and operational fixes. I mean, I'm presenting it a bit black and white. But with what you just said, I mean, is that something that you think should still be pursued? For example, improvements in working methods, could that be used to build up trust between Europe and Africa, but also potentially other partners, to unlock structural reforms on the one hand within or with regards to the Security Council, or maybe even to offer a space to think about and conceptualize an alternative beyond the Security Council? Or how do you look at this apparent tension between what European and African policymakers primarily prioritize, and how that could take the structural reform of the UN Security Council forward?
Well, so I think, firstly, to sort of explain these different approaches, I'd make 2 points. I mean, firstly, if you're a European diplomat, you understand that the Security Council is in trouble. But the Europeans actually have a pretty sweet deal in the Security Council as it stands right now. There are 15 Security Council seats. 5 of those are currently held by members of the European Union, including 2 vetoes. So, from a European perspective, really dramatic change inevitably has downsides, even if you see that change is necessary, which of course means that Europeans are more cautious. Secondly, there is also something that you mentioned in the paper, but I don't think Gustavo mentioned in his remarks. There is no common European position on what reform should look like. There's a great difference, which is Africa has a very clear model for reform, but won't tell us who the permanent members from Africa would be. The Europeans don't have a coherent model for reform, but they do have one country, Germany, that is very clear that it should be a permanent member. But then that means you also have Spain, Italy, and others who are very opposed to having Germany as a permanent member. And so, one of the reasons the Europeans like to talk about procedure is that they don't actually have a model for reform that they can sort of rally around. I mean, I think we have seen some good practices in terms of improving working methods over the last 4 or 5 years, coming back to your question. And I think one of the more positive developments we've seen in the Security Council has been that the British and French in particular have become more open to sharing pen holding, that's the drafting of Security Council resolutions, with African members. Again, 4 or 5 years ago, the line in the British mission here or the French mission was, we know how to write Security Council resolutions, the elected members don't, so we will continue to lead on these processes. But we've actually seen France and the UK, on cases like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo agreeing to share pen holding duties with members of the African Three, and also some other elected members. And so, that's a small step, but it is a sign of some of the major European powers within the UN, accepting and opening up to, the African groups, very justified demand for greater voice on affairs on the continent. I think in the absence of fundamental Security Council reform, of course we need to keep on trying to improve the working methods. Of course we need to try to keep on improving how the body functions. But I have never been fully convinced that you can get to Security Council reform incrementally through working on the margins. I think you work on the margins because you want the existing council to work better. I think that you only get to fundamental council reform if you have sort of a considerably bigger political push. It's not something that diplomats can do from below on their own.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And maybe I wanted to turn to Gustavo to pick on something that you mentioned in your presentation, is that on sort of balancing reforms with regards to the international financial institutions and the UN Security Council, is that for some African interlocutors and counterparts, actually the reform of international financial institutions is more urgent and of a higher political priority than the UN Security Council at the moment. So how do you see this kind of, for African and European policymakers, as something to look at jointly, or to put dedicated strategies for both those reforms, or should they be connected entirely? So would be very happy to get some more thoughts, Gustavo, from your side on those two reform tracks, let's say, and how they're connected.
I think it's a very important question, because I think to a large degree, I think it brings to this fundamental question around what is the world that a continent like Africa would like to see. Because when we talk about Security Council reform, it is about effectiveness, it is about legitimacy, it's about credibility, but it's particularly about representation. But when we see in terms of the challenges, that the similar challenges that exist within international financial institutions, that there is a perception and there is evidence around that, where global South countries at large, and particularly African countries, have a stronger economic participation now than what we previously had, but this ability of influencing decision-making still remains very much problematic. And I think to a certain degree, I think it goes back to the question of what type of reforms do we want? Because there is a sense that for a number of years, there is almost this convenience of a slow process that doesn't really fully change things, because the status quo was for not only for the P5, but also for a number of countries, was still good enough. It was still good enough that they still managed to have a lot of their representation. They managed to do a lot of the decision making was very much what they were able to get, while the demands from global South countries, whether it's from Africa, whether it is from the G4, not entirely a global South like India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. To a certain degree, that brings to it. But I think there is a slight change of narrative within the African continent that is important for us to look into. Last year, during the General Assembly, we looked into how African countries responded to this change in terms of financing and development financing from OECD countries, or reduced funds for development initiatives and so on. And it was quite a surprise for us, because initially we were expecting it was going to be more mourning from African countries complaining about that. What was clear to us, there was a very obvious shift of a narrative that is not new, but it's certainly taken a lot of shape, that the development of the continent will be done not through aid and not necessarily through traditional types of development partnerships, but one that increases the investment within the continent, that increases the added value of the continent within international economic systems, and in a way that generates enough revenue so that the continent can finance its own development by itself. So I think this linkage between the United Nations Security Council reform, but also the reform of international financial institutions, is very much one where geopolitical issues are intrinsically connected to geoeconomic issues. And we cannot fully disassociate either at this particular moment. While for a long period, for some of us working on peace and security issues, we could almost ignore aspects of economics, trade, finances, investments, supply chains. At the moment, they are very much interconnected, and we cannot really see those. The interesting aspects of that, and I will conclude it here on this question, it is the fact that when we're talking about international financial institutions, we have a number of different avenues beyond the United Nations where the discussions take place, whether it's in a very problematic G20, I would say, in 2026, with a lot of challenges, not only with the fact that we have South Africa being uninvited to attend any of those meetings and having Poland replacing the country in those regards, but we also have other avenues and spaces in which that we can look into that, including through institutions like BRICS that have been having its own internal debates around UN Security Council reform, and a lot of challenges that are very similar to those that we see outside of BRICS, when you had traditionally with your original 5 members of BRICS, India, Brazil, South Africa, China, and Russia, where you have IBSA on the one side and China and Russia on the other side, and a lot of interesting discussion happening since the expansion. But also, how do we create those bridges? I think it is certainly something important to reflect, because at this stage, reform of international institutions it's clear that more of the same is not good enough if we want to maintain a resemblance of mechanisms of collective security. The crisis that we see now, it is structural and fundamental enough that should create incentives for countries to look for options and alternatives to make sure that we get into a point where perhaps we don't get a perfect reform of any of those international institutions, but maybe that we may be able to find a space where we find some kind of a reform that is perhaps good enough for us.
Thank you, Gustavo. And I think with that reflection on financing, I think we can also make the link to the UN Security Council Resolution 2719 that you mentioned. I mean, there's a range of concepts that have been floating around to sort of define the shift in the multilateral order that we're witnessing at the moment with, for example, this concept of multiplexity, where you will have issue-based organizations or coalitions. But that then leads to a question on what are sort of the global public goods that regions like Europe and Africa or individual countries still want to address collectively, and how to do that. And so, to me, a question on global peace and security, or peace and security as a global public good and challenge, how do you assess the funding and financial support that will be needed, and to which extent do you, and also Richard, please come into this as well, how much of this will still come from the UN, given that the resolution was adapted or accepted but never implemented, or should we look at radically different sources of funding to set up systems to respond to peace and security challenges, including in Africa?
I think it is important for us to almost unpack the process that led to Resolution 2719. Because for years, the discussion was about the fact that the African Union and a lot of regional economic communities were almost entirely dependent on external funding support from external partners, and particularly from European countries and the United States for a long time. And the debate was, how do we make this share of responsibilities more equitable? Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about this kind of motto that became very much a cliche within the continent, but I think is often misunderstood, of that we need to identify African solutions to African challenges. We normally think that in terms of the African continent saying that no one else should intervene within our continent, only us should do that, and we should always be in the forefront of that. When in reality, when we're talking about the origins and the developments of these African solutions for African challenges, we're really talking about those solutions for the African challenges when we have a context of the international community may not be willing or able to respond. And if when we have the deployment of the African Union or SADC or ECHO in a particular space, these are usually done through the authorization or mandating from the United Nations Security Council that explicitly states that these are not threats to regional peace and security. It's a threat to international peace and security, and therefore there is a shared responsibility of the international community to do so. Now, the challenge is that we face a lot of issues here, not only because passing the resolution perhaps was very difficult, but was the easiest step in that all. What does it mean, a lot of those aspects? What type of financing and how do we engage with that? I think some of the solutions are already being discussed and increasingly becoming more important, especially within the narratives and the actions within Africa when it comes to an increasing financing coming from the African continent itself. I think we've seen an interesting development from the African Peace Fund that now is actually ranging for almost $1 billion of pledged contributions from different sources and ways that could provide some particular support to create other types of creative mechanisms around that. And if we've seen something that, despite a lot of the challenges that the African Union has faced over the years in terms of its own capabilities of deployment, what certainly we've been able to see is that the African Union has a very nimble and adaptable structure that allows it to find different exciting, sometimes less exciting mechanisms and responses that is often quite hard to find, like what is the toolbox that the African Union has on itself. For the early years of the AU, we were talking very much about this idea of the rehatting processes, where the African Union perhaps was going to become more of a first respondent in peace and security crisis, to a point that we developed hybrid missions with the UN, like in the case of Darfur, support packages, ad hoc security coalitions, very targeted, narrow and small co-deployment of personnel, civilian and military personnel within member states. And I think this is what we need to look into. We can't really see those traditional responses that we have developed over the last 30 years, neither as the templates that will stay and stick, and perhaps looking into smaller size, more specific, more nimble, more adaptable structures, approaches that places the continent in a very interesting space, but also looking into how other players can also be of support, not only because we see African countries as begging out around the world for this particular type of support, but that we know that a more stable, a more developing Africa will have a much stronger spillover effect to the rest of the global economy. And I think looking into more creative terms and not only looking back in terms, how do we go back to the 2000s in this kind of big growing space for peacekeeping operations that almost became a solution for everything that we could identify under the sun, but really to find more creative ways that respond to a constraining environment, that supports potentially the implementation of Resolution 2719, but it creates more effective mechanisms to deal with peace and security issues that will not disappear simply because we have a more fragmented world order.
Thanks very much, Gustavo. Richard, you also wanted to come in on this one?
Yeah, a few thoughts. I mean, one slightly cynical observation. Gustavo was very kind, saying that European countries were key to pushing forward the argument for 2719. That is true, but one of the reasons that European countries favored UN funding to the African Union was because European countries wanted to pay less from their own budgets or from the EU common budget to support African missions like the one in Somalia. This was a very, very clear message from the Europeans in New York was we need a UN mechanism to fund African missions because bilateral aid, as it were, from Europe for these operations is going to decline. So actually, yes, the Europeans wanted this, but it was actually, in a sense, slightly an indication of a reduced European commitment to African peace and security, not necessarily the Europeans stepping up. And secondly, on 2719, look, Crisis Group, like you guys, we advocated very hard for this for quite a long time. We wrote a lot about it. We were strongly supportive of the whole initiative. But I do worry that getting that resolution, getting the theoretical mechanism for UN funding to the African Union did become potentially a distraction from what Gustavo's talking about, which is sort of looking for new ways both to source funding and also to sort of imagine future peace operations in Africa. I mean, I think that it's inevitable that once you sort of have a concept on the table, everyone sort of focuses very narrowly on it. And I think there were also some gaps in understanding between Addis and New York about what 2719 was going to deliver. I think in New York, it was seen as a positive step forward on a procedural front. I think in Addis and many African capitals, there was a feeling that once we had the mechanism, it would start working, it would start releasing cash pretty quickly. And, in early 2024, once the resolution had been passed, we did see, quite a lot of ideas for 2719 funded missions sort of coming from different parts of the African continent, which the UN really wasn't ready to absorb and the Security Council wasn't ready to absorb. So I think we may have ended up focusing on something and inflating the potential value of a particular mechanism, perhaps beyond what we should have. I still think that 2719 is useful. I still actually believe that it will be used down the road. There will be cases where it is the right mechanism to support African-led peace operations. Even members of the Trump administration who are quite negative towards everything that we're talking about say they can imagine situations where they would support the use of 2719 as a funding mechanism. So I think it's good to have. But again, I think that it shouldn't be our sole focus. We should be thinking more broadly, as Gustavo describes.
Thanks, Richard and Gustavo. So that leaves us, I guess, also with space for us to also think about where those new forms of peace and security initiatives or peacekeeping operations, how they could be shaped and supported in different innovative forms. That's probably an emerging area of sort of policy interest and research. Now maybe sort of in terms of, and I see a few questions in the chat emerging as well, so I think we can go to those. Maybe a final question from my side is that, of course, we have these political moments coming up or already taking place with the UN 80 reform process, also a leadership transition at the head of the UN. Also, the groundwork starting for any kind of post-SDG framework, with a lot of questions on how that will be looked at. Peace and security was one of the SDGs, and it's hard to imagine that some actors currently will accept an equally comprehensive framework. So a lot of questions around that. But still, for both of you, what would you see as kind of one, I mean, in the next 2-3 years, most achievable reform that Europe and Africa could deliver together? From Gustavo's side, of course, and as one of the authors of the policy brief, we've put 3 of those in the concluding remarks. But would be happy to get your additional thoughts on that, and also from you, Richard, what success would look like with the ongoing UN reform process taking place, but also wider, further ahead, looking at the post-SDG framework that will emerge in a few years. I don't know who wants to go first, Gustavo or Richard.
I'll hop in.
Yeah.
So look, firstly, I wouldn't put too much weight on UN80. I mean, UN80 is really just a cost-cutting exercise that the Secretary General launched to try and keep the UN afloat during this very difficult financial period. It does have a structural reform element, but the structural reform element doesn't really relate to Security Council reform. It's more about things like merging some UN agencies, such as UN Women and the UN Population Fund. And to be honest, as we have the Secretary General now in his final year in office, parts of that process continue to move forward, but I don't think that anyone is expecting sort of really big reforms anytime soon. Certainly some countries that are very invested in Security Council reform, such as India, have been quite dismissive of UN80 because they say that it is a distraction from what they really want to see, which is fundamental political change. In terms of the Secretary General selection process, I mean, this is, obviously it's a big focus because it's fun. And everyone likes a race for a leadership position that attracts attention. I think it's going to be interesting because one thing you can say about Antonio Guterres is that he has been very, very committed to the agenda of empowering Africa on peace and security issues. He very much advocated for ideas similar to those in 2719. He has very much advocated for Africa to lead on operations on the continent, to some extent at the expense of Blue Helmet operations. And Guterres has actually been more explicit, I think, than any former Secretary General, saying that Africa deserves greater representation on the Security Council. Kofi Annan was very strong on the need for Security Council reform, but I think on this specific point, Guterres has gone further. We don't know who will replace him. I think it may take quite a long time to find out, because I think it's going to be very difficult for the big powers to agree on anyone. I've heard lots of names flying around. I mean, there are some candidates in the open like Rafael Grossi, but you hear other names like Mr. Infantini, the head of FIFA, who seems to be very close to Mr. Trump, being suggested, so we can't say. What we don't know, and I think is really important actually, is will the next Secretary General remain as committed to the African peace and security agenda as the current guy has been? It is not guaranteed you will have a Secretary General who is so aligned with African preferences, especially if they're someone who feels they have to align very closely with Washington. And it's quite possible that you'll have a Secretary General like Ban Ki-moon who says, Security Council reform is above my pay grade. Ban never really commented on council reform. He didn't think that he had a mandate to do so. So, Guterres' successor may not be as strong on this as Guterres himself has been. So actually, if I'm looking at this situation from an African perspective, I would be lobbying very hard, and especially lobbying with the Europeans and with especially the Brits and the French, who, are key players in the selection process, saying, we want another leader who will continue to respect African preferences and continue to sort of work very closely with the continent. And I think that actually needs to be a strong message from the African group as we go into the selection process, which formally begins with hearings with the candidates in late April. We don't want a Secretary General who drifts away from African concerns. And then finally, what's an area for European-African cooperation that I would emphasize that doesn't really feature in your paper? I would actually focus on migration, because migration is an area where clearly you need strong European-African cooperation to promote regular positive migration. But it's also an area where we can see that this US administration is going to be enormously disruptive within the UN system. You heard President Trump at the General Assembly last September being incredibly offensive about migration and the UN's role in promoting migration. And I think that actually this is an area, it's very, very sensitive for obvious political reasons. This is an area where you're going to need leadership from Europe and Africa to defend the current refugee regime, but also redesign the way that UNHCR and IOM work to promote safe, responsible migration policies.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And I see some questions related to that as well coming up in the chat, so we'll be able to unpack them a little bit more. Gustavo, would you have some points to add?
Yeah, I want to be quite brief because I think Richard mentioned a lot of the issues, and I think Richard is right. I think the challenge with UN80 is that it often feels to me that it's another of those kind of structural thinking processes within the UN, and we've seen so many of those in the past 3 decades, whether it's the merger of departments, the reform of peace and security mechanisms within the UN. And I think we kind of almost get a band-aid when we effectively what we need is a surgery. And I think in that regard, there's an important role for member states to really look into more of the same is perhaps not enough. Because even if we get into a point where the Security Council is reformed, and I honestly don't think that we're going to get any meaningful reform in the next 2 to 3 years. This is a long-term process that we have to be thinking, but we need to utilize those processes, whether it's UN80, we're having at the moment the mandate implementation review within the United Nations, discussions on the SDGs and so on, and we need to make pressure that it's not just this low-hanging fruits that is what we are pursuing, because we may have a correct diagnosis of the challenges that exist within the United Nations. But if our low-hanging fruits is always geared towards how the institution and the bureaucracy is structured and how it is actually engaging with, we're not really going to reach any meaningful process around that. But I do think that there is important momentum that can be created, because I think part of the challenge, it is to do with the fact that the Security Council reform discussions remain very superficial. We're still very much obsessive with the discussion about participation and representation, and very much less discussing about specifically if are we seriously thinking of the question that if we do expand the UN Security Council membership and participation, will that make things any better? What are the other things that we need to consider in terms of international responses to that? And that leads to very difficult conversations. What is the role of the UN General Assembly? What is the issue? And I saw briefly one of the questions around the issue of veto, consensus, majorities. And I think all of those issues is what is important to do, because effectively we saw that around 2 years ago, just after the Summit of the Future, when IPSA countries present their joint position in the margins of the General Assembly, talking about calling a UN conference to revise the Article 109 of the UN Security Council. But despite that, there is very limited appetite, even from the countries that want a Security Council reform done, in terms of calling some of those discussions, because I think it is seen to many as a very difficult process to actually operate. And I think for Europe and Africa, I think there is a lot of conversations that can happen in parallel, but they can feed into that. So What are some of those frameworks around financing, which will continue existing between Europe and Africa on a lot of peace and security matters? How do we use some of those discussions around the role of Resolution 2719 in a place like Somalia? A very difficult conversation to be held and a lot of tricky positions in different corners. But how do we see the role of those different regions in engaging with that? And I think, Sophie, you mentioned a very important process that we need to start considering here, is that what will be the future of Goal 16 that currently exists within the Sustainable Development Goals in a post-2030 negotiation framework. And we've had in the negotiations in the 2010s a common African position on what eventually became Goal 16. Very similar views, often, not always, from European countries when it comes to that. But how do we do not only those continental positions, but perhaps bridge those connections between the two continents that would make their views and roles? And the final quick point is that what do we do with the very obvious and visible absence of the United States in many of those spaces, in a space that for us in Africa, Africa remains the biggest priority, that despite this reluctance and distancing from the United States, there is perhaps one benefit of that Africa simply doesn't matter that much. So that perhaps give us a different margin of maneuver of finding solutions, finding approaches that involve the United Nations, but also involve other tools as well that complement that to one extent or another.
Thanks a lot, Gustavo, and also Richard, for those points. And a few of the questions in the chat also look at that. And Gustavo, you already picked up on sort of the question of whether it's not only about enlargement, but about how decisions are taken with large. I think Richard already in the beginning mentioned that this would require charter reform, which just seems very, very, very hard to achieve at the moment. But it's true that those lessons from enlargement and how decisions are taken in international bodies and organizations will probably need to be taken into account in any or in some way or another when thinking about UN reforms. There's also a question from Georgios Kostakos on where leadership and these fresh ideas and dynamism could come beyond the UN80 initiative, and what some of the spaces and platforms could be. And I think this also relates to the question on, the P5, that they're not all the same, but of course they have very strong vested interest in keeping the status quo. The US has never been kind of the multilateral partner par excellence, but in this moment it's actually not only disinterested or uninterested, but actually actively disruptive. So where will alternative ideas and dynamism come from beyond UN80 that could have implications on UN reform? And maybe a third question from Owen O'Leary from Search for Common Ground is, there is this cost benefit discussion and a reduction overall in funds for international cooperation, but also for peace and security, while we know that conflict prevention is much cheaper than actually conflict responses like we had in the scale of those traditional peacekeeping operations. I guess what Owen is also asking is, why is it so hard to put those on the table, especially when international partners are looking at, reduced funds and how to still tackle peace and security reforms? So maybe we can start with those questions. And then there's another one on new structures emerging, which we can take in a second round. So one on where the dynamism, fresh ideas, and innovative ways could come from. Another one on sort of, is the reform or an adaptation of the charter, is it really so far out of reach? And kind of balancing between conflict prevention and peacekeeping and what it means for UN reform. I don't know who wants to start, Richard or Gustavo, with any points you want to tackle.
So, I mean, within the UN system, I do think that while I pointed to some potential downsides of the change of Secretary General from an African perspective, I think there is also a feeling around UN headquarters that having a new Secretary General coming in with a new mandate, with new political energy, does create some opportunities, just by definition. You know, a new figure at the head will have a bit more political leverage. And I think there is also a very strong feeling around the House that the next Secretary General needs to focus very hard on peace and security issues. Although Guterres has, I think, been strong on African peace and security overall, he is generally seen as having been quite weak in terms of his use of his own good offices and his own capacity to do behind-the-scenes diplomacy around conflict. And, you know, I hear member states from across all regions saying that they would like to see the next Secretary General, whoever she is or whoever he is, you know, coming with a new focus on peace and security, because everyone is just very scared about where the world is going. I think looking beyond the UN, well, the answer seems to be Canada. We are all currently mega fans of Prime Minister Carney and his discussion of the rupture, which I think you referred to, Sophie, at the start of your remarks. But I think that what Carney actually said was important, which is that in a period where the big powers do seem to be involved in building up spheres of influence, where the big powers are trying to limit the voices of a lot of other nations, you know, middle powers from different regions do need to band together, and do need to sort of talk through what a functioning international order looks like. And, you know, I think a lot of people had a lot of respect, by the way, for the fact that South Africa, you know, continued with its agenda in the G20 despite all the noise and disruption from the US last year. And so you can imagine a world where the Canadas, the Indonesias, the South Africas sort of come together and start talking about what a better system would look like. I actually wrote a piece in International Affairs that came out last month, arguing that maybe the best thing to do with the Security Council is just leave it as a space where China, the US, and Russia can talk to each other and deconflict, which has value. And, you know, maybe a lot of the real action for other countries has to happen elsewhere, because that's where they will have more space. I think I think on the difficulties of UN Charter reform, maybe I've just worked on UN reform for too long. I just, I know I've definitely worked on UN reform for too long, but I'm always pessimistic about the chances of Charter reform, but I think I've articulated that. And then to Owen's question about conflict prevention and why we can't prioritize conflict prevention and peace building, you know, I sometimes wonder whether the UN is the right place to do that. I think that academic studies have shown that actually it tends to be regional organizations and regional coalitions that are more effective in terms of preventive diplomacy. And so maybe we shouldn't be looking to the UN to lead on prevention. In a lot of cases, maybe we should be doing it ourselves through other channels. I think the UN is still well equipped to do some peace building work. You know, and there is some energy around peace building in the UN system at the moment. But I mean, the reality is that in a period of, you know, hard power and great power politics, that just doesn't get the attention that it should a lot of the time through the Security Council.
Gustavo, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to perhaps talk a little bit about the issue about these very large footprint operations versus conflict prevention initiatives. And Richard is absolutely right. There is overwhelming evidence that showcases that prevention and longer-term engagement with countries that fundamentally involve civilian functions rather than military functions tends to have better results when it's implemented. But I think there is some almost existential challenges around this within the United Nations. I think one of them is that peacekeeping operations are simply much easier to identify. There are institutions of their own. You know where peacekeeping starts, you know where it ends, because at the end of the day, there is a mandate that is authorized by the UN Security Council. There is the deployment of military, police, and civilian personnel on the ground, which are operating across the spectrum of conflict resolution tools, whether it's peacemaking, whether it's peace building, whether it's even peace enforcement, and that became quite important, especially in the 2000s and 2010s, while peace building, conflict prevention becomes for many, including for member states, a much more fuzzy space for them to understand where does it start, where does it end, and what is our own particular role. We've seen that very clearly within the challenges that the UN peacebuilding architecture has faced since its creation in 2006, not only because the United States now have stepped out from those institutions, but fundamentally because there was always a very difficult relationship between the UN Security Council and the UN Peacebuilding Commission because of the issue about attributions, who is responsible for what, and what is the delegation of authority, and what is the responsibility of different organs. But I think there is another issue that when we are talking about conflict prevention and peacebuilding issues, there is this issue that the twin resolutions of Sustaining Peace of 2016 talk very clearly. It is the fact that we're talking about a process we're talking about activities and responses that are identified, but we're talking about objectives on their own. It's both a goal and a process at the same time, which doesn't necessarily mean that the United Nations is necessarily the best positioned institution to do that. Doesn't even necessarily mean that external actors and even regional organizations are the best place to drive processes that are intrinsically sustainable. That requires a change of mindset that it is very important to happen, and it's being very difficult to do. And perhaps this new process, and I know Crisis Group utilize this term quite often in their pieces, that if Trump 1.0 was about doing more with less, Trump 2.0 forces United Nations to do less with less, is to see what types of other types of approaches and responses and actors and players that can be empowered to really develop those functions that effectively deal with those objectives that we want to achieve, that creates a much more nimble and perhaps even more fragmented range of players than what we have at the moment. But really, I think it is something that we're getting very close to a point where this is not just what we must do because it is relevant, it makes sense, it is backed by empirical evidence, but simply because we have no other option. And I think it is important to, part of this shift, really to move away from the shift that this Christmas tree mandate that puts anything and everything under the sun within mandates of peacekeeping operations, expecting them to do well things that are perhaps not well equipped to do, and finding other options and alternatives that are part of it through region organizations, through the United Nations, through UN agencies, through the private sector, through national governments, through bilateral partners, and understanding that this complexity of environments, it is naturally what peace building and conflict prevention processes are, but we need a better thinking internationally of what is multilateral responses towards that. And perhaps a moment of crisis, it's often the place to think about alternatives and solutions.
Thanks, Gustavo. And that's actually the perfect segue to another round of questions in the chat on how that process of coming up with new forms of collaboration and shaping those responses in different formats to making sure that those institutions indeed offer a way forward and that we avoid getting stuck in the same cycle, because, I mean, in the end, those new institutions and new ways of working are still going to take place in the same context that we're looking at now with sort of high geopolitical competition and disruption. So how can we make sure that we kind of keep the high level platform for China, Russia, and the US at the Security Council, and that they leave the others to do kind of more constructive work somehow in other platforms, and that there is space to do something that can really offer a change of responses. And related to that, two questions on the lack of a unified reform position on the European side, whether that's primarily the result of diverging opinions or just a lack of strategic interest in actually pursuing this. And I think we already heard that in a way European member states are not actually asking for a change of the status quo as such, although they are confronted with a situation that is also not in their best interest. And then on the AU side, also a question on what dimensions of the AU reform would require some more attention to strengthen Africa's agency, and a more defined foreign policy approach, perhaps, to the reform of multilateral institutions. And then maybe a final question on how we can ensure also a civilian and human rights focused approach in, for example, designing these alternative forms of multilateral cooperation on peace and security. A lot of questions. I leave it to the both of you to pick on those elements that you find most interesting, and then we will close after that last round.
Maybe if I could just share some thoughts here, and I wanted to start with the question on the African Union reform, because I think perhaps the AU reforms of the 2010s really give us a space for thinking not only on what to do, but primarily on what not to do. The Kagame process that led to the identification of what a lot of diagnostics that I think are very correct in terms of some of the challenges. I think what the AU did and is still trying to figure out how to manage that is really to pick some of those low-hanging fruits. And those low-hanging fruits often related to the way in which the bureaucracy of the AU Commission were designed, rather than thinking more deeply around the role of member states, the division of labor between different organs, whether we're talking about the Assembly, the Permanent Representative Council, and the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. And I think to a large degree, it did bring back certain level of control of the African Union to member states, but it still created a whole new wave of challenges that the African Union still faces around that. And I think we do need to think not only how to make the UN more fit for purpose, but we still need to think more effectively how do we make the African Union itself more fit for purpose in those issues? Whether we're talking about the role of institutions and whether is it the AU or whether it's the United Nations, they go beyond simply the role of the United Nations Security Council, not simply because we need to, if we have a paralyzed United Nations Security Council, that we have to bypass it, but also is to acknowledge that not every response requires that often responses can be part of regional, national, cross-regional conversations that can yield into effective spaces. And I think that is something that we need to think very clearly about: what types of not only financing mechanisms, but what types of arrangements, tools do we have to respond to those, and fundamentally think in a way that makes the responses more creative, that acknowledge that there is a limitation in terms of how many of those institutions that we have, in terms of their own capability of reaching any degree of consensus at the moment, but looking into more innovative approaches around that. And I think it is something that we need to be brave, and I think our member states, our civil societies, our academia, our think tanks, our policymakers do need to think in more creative terms, that we need to think that more of the same, once again, is simply not enough at this space. We need to look into, of course, those big global geopolitical issues that by themselves, their identification of what is important and what it's not is a very charged issue. That the fact that member states tend to look into certain issues, whether it's the situation in Palestine, whether it's the situation in Ukraine, and so on, as this kind of higher tier geopolitical issues, we need to be able to find ways around it that strengthen those spaces that have more opportunity and potential to actually be more effective, and then to acknowledge that perhaps the dismantling of an institution like the United Nations is not in our benefits, but we need to find ways in which within the United Nations system that we can find more effective results, even if it means a stronger acknowledgement of limitations of what we can effectively do.
Thanks a lot, Gustavo. I sense still some optimism, and now I turn to Richard.
To bring the pessimism. No, I mean, look, I will just conclude with two points, because I thoroughly support Gustavo's call for us to be imaginative at this moment. I think that it is absolutely true that in moments of crisis, it's very easy to sort of hunker down, but it's essential actually to think big in response to the moment that we face. I mean, just 2 points. Firstly, on the question about why Europe does not have a cohesive position on Security Council reform, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, the fact is that Germany has long claimed that, given its size and economic strength, it should have a seat on the Security Council. It's been saying that since the 1990s. But you have other European countries led by Spain and Italy that worry that if Germany did get a permanent seat, their own weight in UN affairs would inevitably decline. And so they have always opposed Berlin's ambitions. In the words of one former Italian ambassador, we lost the Second World War too. And so that division is sort of about really power within the continent. And then on the question about, okay, if we did make the reforms, if we did have a new Security Council, a new composition, would it actually make things better? And I think that's actually a really key question to address. I have heard, for example, one Latin American colleague who was very, very critical. This is a Latin American diplomat in New York, who was very critical of the current Security Council structure. But he said, I sometimes worry about what would happen if the African group did have permanent seats with vetoes, because I worry that the African veto powers would just start blocking UN action on the continent. So maybe just here's a thought to end with. Maybe we should actually run a scenario. Let's do a war game with an enlarged Security Council. Let's get the 24 people or whatever to represent who the members of an enlarged Security Council would be, and acting as the different countries. And let's see what happens in that scenario if you have a crisis like the war in Sudan. Would it lead to a more efficient diplomatic outcome or not? That would actually be a really interesting exercise to do, and I don't think I've heard of many NGOs running anything like that. So that could be quite a fun exercise as well.
Thanks a lot, Sir Richard, for putting that on our radar. And I want to thank both of you, Gustavo de Carvalho, Senior Researcher at SAIIA, and Richard Gowan, Program Director, Global Issues and Institutions at Crisis Group, for your time and the very interesting conversations. Also, thank you very much to the participants for your great questions. That leaves it just for me to hand over back to Stephen for final remarks and closing this webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. Such a rich discussion, so many avenues that we've explored. It's difficult to sum up, but I'll just leave you with a few thoughts. One is that multilateral institutions take a long time to die. If you think it took a world war to replace the Congress of Europe, basically, with the League of Nations, and it took another world war for that institution to die and morph into the United Nations. We saw the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, but many would say not real change. So, can we save ourselves short of having another huge global conflagration? I think what we've seen in the discussion today is the return of national interests, be they from big or small countries, and we have to eventually find a way to stop talking about I and me and start talking about we and finding that common humanity. It's difficult. We had a big test in the COVID times when vaccine nationalism reared its head and countries were grabbing what they could for their own citizens and not worrying about what would happen in the rest of the world. And I think that's damaging. I think also it's so difficult. Um, it's a numbers game for Europe and Africa. I mean, if you add the 55 countries in Africa to 45, 50 countries in Europe, that's an automatic majority in the United Nations, but it doesn't work like that. And I think the power realities of contemporary geopolitics are very, very important. And I think one of the things that prevents Europe and Africa working more closely together is the very difficult past that the continents have had through slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, migration, reparations. All of these very thorny and difficult issues are always in the background. And finally, to say, I think if the audience is not aware of it, there's a very interesting organization, also partly funded by the Global Challenges Foundation, called Article 109, which is trying to create a groundswell for that very conference that Richard mentioned, where 2/3 of the United Nations members plus the five Security Council veto powers would actually agree to have a conference to reform the UN. And they're doing interesting work, and I urge everybody to have a look at it. Finally, to say thank you to ECDPM for working so closely with us. It's really been a fascinating journey. We've really enjoyed it. Global North and Global South working together on a very difficult question. Please read the policy brief. It's been posted in the chat at the beginning, but also you can find it on the ECDPM website, and you'll also find it, I think, within a couple of days on the SAIIA website. So just to close, a minute before we are meant to, just to say thank you very much, and everybody have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen, for those kind words. Likewise, it's been a great cooperation and joint initiative. And also thank you again to the Global Challenges Foundation for their support and for everyone for being here today with us. Have a great afternoon and hope to engage at a later stage with everyone.